You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
We'll try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I am very excited. My guest is Alex Josephson, the co-founder of Partisans Studio, an architecture design firm based out of Canada. Thank you so much for coming to join me.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here, Kyle, and I'm happy we made it happen.
Yeah, one of the biggest thrills for me is when I get to talk to artists and, designers, architects, people who are really good at what they're doing. And, your design firm, like you've won awards, you've done all sorts of amazing and interesting projects. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit. But before I do,
we arted. We like to art.
You have arted quite a bit in many, many locations. And it has left a mark in numerous cities. So I'm loving what you're creating. But before we get into that, It is March. I am doing my Arts Madness style and giving listeners the opportunity to take pleasure in passing judgment on all sorts of artists and architects. In round one, I had Frank Gehry up against Frank Lloyd Wright, and I'm curious, as an architect, who would you pick in that epic battle?
It's funny, it's a hard choice. I have a soft spot, and I got to meet Frank Gehry a few times, so I also resonate with his work. I would pick Frank Gehry, but that being said, his friend Frank Stella, Richard Serra, would say he wasn't an artist, so neither of them arted, and we aren't arting, and it's not a question. You're not allowed to ask it. I don't know if you've seen that interview with Frank Gehry's friend Richard Serra while they were both in their virile 80s, I think. But it's a spectacular interview by Richard Serra that says that architecture simply is not art, and art is created out of nothing, and it is for nothing, and that is what makes it art. I mean, I'm obviously paraphrasing a genius, but he said that Frank Gehry certainly didn't make art, and I thought that was an interesting thing for one of Frank Gehry's friends to say about him.
Well, and that's interesting in and of itself, and kind of a brilliant segue here. So I'm just gonna do the listeners, if you want to vote in this week's Arts Madness round, check the links to the show notes. But you're right away getting at kind of what I wanted to focus on out the gate of philosophy, because you're saying his point was that all art is useless, that once it becomes practical and functional, it's no longer so much about art, at least as I understand that quote. Am I right there?
I mean, I think that was part of what he said, but he said it so eloquently. Richard Serra was an incredibly erudite person. I think that he came from a generation of artists that could really wordsmith and could speak to the theory and philosophies of art in a critical way that I don't think really happens anymore. And you can go back to Motherwell and those guys. I mean, those incredible, right?
Yeah. But I do want to get at how do you? Because I personally do view architecture as an art form. I think the stuff that you're doing is absolutely beautiful, and I personally am kind of a generalist. I'm going to be honest. I know a little bit about a lot of things, and I know some of the basics of modern architecture, form follows function and all of that stuff that is covered in every 100 level course. But can you talk to us a little bit about sort of the underpinnings of modern and contemporary architecture, and maybe even just how those two are different, because modern in the artistic
between modern and contemporary, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, because it's so fluid and mutated that it's what are the borders? What are the boundaries? I see the question, and I think it's a problem because you see the word modern appearing in places where it doesn't belong.
Mm-hmm.
Like some people have said, "Oh, your work is too modern," and it's like, well, my work isn't modern. It's something else. It's new. It's contemporary. It's actually maybe futurist. It's not modern. Modern is a very specific thing. Modernism, and what are the boundaries of it? Well, it depends on who you ask. And I come from a kind of phenomenological background. I studied architecture under Robert Jan van Pelt at the University of Waterloo, and then had a little brief stint where I dropped out of the AA about 8 years later. But the people that I studied under wrote and read art and architecture theory and history. And so when does modernism begin? In painting, you could argue it began in the mid-19th century. Courbet's painting. I mean, you can pin modernism in art and architecture to many things and moments in time, but when one started and when one ended. So when did modernism end? You could say modernism ended in 1968 in the social revolution, when the kind of rigidity of the rules of a kind of fascistic approach to modernism started to fray under the weight of more explorative and figurative and also I would say freer expressions of form, at least in architecture. But if you look at art also, when does the modern art period end? Right? Like some might say that it ends around that time as well.
Yeah, and
quote modern.
For me, I'm less interested in names and dates are wonderful, but when I think of and conceptualize the beginning of the modern period in art generally, I think of, like you said, the mid to late 19th century. I think of it as the radical shift we saw in painting styles as a response to technology, be it the camera and the tube of paint, and to the way, the impressionists and plein air, and the changes to compositional style and all of that sort of stuff, and truth to materials, and the notions of we're not looking at the apples that Cezanne was observing, we're looking at it as mediated through his lens, and all of that sort of stuff, a painting of the apples instead of the apples themselves, and those kinds of ideas. And in architecture, I think of it as, the early skyscrapers, and skyscrapers should be in quotes there because it was 10 stories, But I'm trying to think, for you, what are some of the big ideas that were definitive of the modern movement, and how has that changed over time?
I think technology and ideology run parallel, hand in hand. I don't think you have a change of an era just on technology. I think it's a technology and ideological shift as well. So I do think you can speak to certain paintings or pieces of architecture with certain ideas and certain technologies, or lack thereof, depending, that you can start to paint a picture. I arted again. You can start to build a building around, or start to foreground walls around an era. But I think your question is, how does architecture changed over time? And architecture is always, you could argue, and many have, that architecture followed art. It's slow. Architecture is slow. It's plodding. It takes a long time to build architecture. It takes a long time to convince a group of people to build an important piece of architecture, let alone the ambition to get to that point, right? So it tends to be a different cadence, and it tends to lag in architecture. And I think that When you talk about technology, of course, but let's go back to Adolf Loos, who really theorized the beginning of what you might call modern architecture. There's many others. I'm just picking one, and he wrote Ornament and Crime, and this idea that ornament should be eschewed because the technology and the techniques allowed for a more precise construction of architecture. And so the ornament that kind of evolved out of the errors that were prone in many other architectures, to be honest, the decoration was a kind of obfuscation of errors that some architectures produced. Nobody likes to talk about this, but like a lot of this is true, right? The ornament is about mediating the crafts, right?
So it's just like covering up the imperfections.
There are languages of how to mediate vernacular techniques, right? Mm-hmm. And so you had people building things. You had people building churches for hundreds of years, right? And one stonemason flowed onto another, and this decor kind of created the decorative nature. The ornamentation created the architecture. It's not the whole picture, but it's part of the picture. And I think that you talk about Loos, and he said, with the cost of labor now in the late 19th century, early 20th century, was coming into a point where it was expensive to do ornamental things in stone. It was expensive to do ornamental things in anything. And so there was this kind of appreciation of the authenticity of materials in and of themselves to create ornamentation. And that was one of the early modern tenets, right? And you see that in the Barcelona pavilion, right? It's just glass, these very small hexaform columns, and then the stone mirrored, the book matched stone, right? And that is the only memory of ornament, right? This natural authenticity of the marble, right? And so Mies is then posited as the, one of the five canonical architects of modernism, right? And I think that there's a kind of desire to see modernism as reductive, but I think it's also a response to cultural realities, the cost of building buildings, the materials that were then available, and philosophy. I mean, a lot of people equated this sort of fascist approach to minimalist approaches. And you saw that kind of play out in Italy and France in the first part of the first half of the 20th century in various ways. Wars were fought, buildings were built to represent certain things. And in the end, it's funny, the technology is one thing, but I think the ideology is equally as important. Yeah.
And, for listeners unfamiliar with the reference to the Barcelona pavilion, you were talking about Mies van der Rohe's famous design. Mies van der Rohe, I don't think I've covered yet in here, but he did a lot of steel and glass, open concept, beautiful, elegant in its simplicity for the architecture. And really, like you say, he's one of those ones that I think of as his work is my visual model in my head for what modernism was all about. Just like simple, open, airy, and like kind of
reductive,
utilitarian.
I mean, modernism is I think misinterpreted as sometimes as reductive, sometimes as minimalist. It's a response to the realities of a post-figurative world, a post-decorative world, a post-industrialized world where you mass-produced components of buildings. Mm-hmm. Okay? And that, you could say, forms the foundation of modernism, concrete. The techniques of building reinforced concrete were lost for 1,800 years. It's this incredible story, really, that Roman reinforced concrete, the Pantheon, that technology was just somehow, I don't know if it was lost or forgotten or suppressed. I'm not sure, but you went from the Romans casting these incredible domes to people stacking blocks and building castles in the Gothic style for 1,200 years. It's unbelievable, really, right? And then it comes back in the 19th century in France, and you have the béton brut. You have the brutalist style that obviously comes later out of the natural resultant textures that the wood slats that you had to build the formwork out of to pour the concrete in, then left as its mark on the concrete as it dried, as it set. And so I think that, yes, you have these amazing technologies: steel, concrete, glass that was float glass. Glass had to be unrolled from giant oversized bottles that were cut in half, right? And that's how you got these sort of wavy glass and facades and those round windows that, the windows that have it looks like these round, weird concentric circles. That was the bottom part that was cut off of the giant cylinder bottle that was blown before glass was float glass. And so obviously when you get industrialized production of glass, where you had float glass, where you melted thousands of tons of silica and you let that run out onto a molten, perfectly level, 10-foot wide by 300-yard long bed or pool of molten tin, that's float glass, right? And so you went from a manual, mannered series of materials and components that were comprising buildings to these extraordinarily mass-produced elements that really was critical and central to modernism. But it starts to all come apart in the 70s when, well, you could argue earlier, but people started to say, well, this doesn't feel good anymore.
Yeah, because I always think of every movement feels like it's in part a reaction to and somewhat a rejection of what came before. You're looking to liven things up and change things up. And if we take an idea like, form follows function to its logical conclusion, everything becomes, very open, rectangular, and kind of boring.
Does it though? Come on, the whole world around us is organic. The trees, they grow and solve all sorts of problems for themselves by growing organically. Our bodies are organic. We solved for living on the earth through our body. It is an organic thing. And this idea that our architecture has to be this Cartesian approach to industrialized technologies of production is no more a valid validation of form follows function than looking at how the Fibonacci sequence influenced the growth of organic systems in nature. So this idea that and then that leads to form follows finance, and then there's all sorts of other architects that marketed themselves through tropes like this, right?
Well, so I'm not going to pretend that I am as deep in the weeds as you are on this. I'm not going to pretend that I can keep up in that
Let's
debate.
Talk about art instead.
I just all I meant was to me, the modernist approach seemed like it was simplifying to get as open as it could be, as
transparent as
it could be, and then
as light as it could be.
It reaches this saturation point where people start to look at it and yes, this is open, but it's also boring, and that's where I feel like contemporary architecture started to look to other things beyond steel and glass. I see a lot more natural elements incorporated in sort of biophilic design elements brought into things, which to me feels like a more contemporary movement. But I am running out of things where I feel like I have any semblance of a base of knowledge to talk about this. So I'm going to ask you to talk about that shift now.
Let's talk about it. The world was much more regimented 200 years ago. You had classical styles, you had rules, and the international style, even the modernists, they were quite fascist in their approach to whether you were being a modernist or not. And you had to fit into these so-called boxes. Ideologically, it was a very different period even 50 years ago, or actually not 50, more like 100 years ago. But even in the 50s, it was ideological. But today, it's a free for all. This is the liberal. This is what freedom has gotten us. What's interesting, I think, is the chasm that's evolved, and this is a great time to talk about it because of what Trump is doing between modern or contemporary and classical architects. And the reality is that most people feel very comfortable in classical, quote unquote, architectures. And it's interesting because Trump has elected to say that all federal buildings will be built in the neoclassical or Roman classical style, which is a fascinating discussion to have in the context of a time where the craftsmen to build that kind of architecture either are in much shorter supply or don't even live here anymore. And there's very few places that teach that even as a series of craftsmen. So it's a fascinating time to talk about this, but I think it's fascinating because our time is truly open. This is a time where if you want to be a Japanese minimalist modern architect, there is room for you all over the world to build these structures that seemingly don't exist or look like they are held up by nothing. There is a market for that. There is a market for extraordinary classical architecture around the world. Robert Stern. There is a market for sinuous, organic, alien-looking, smooth, futurist architecture. Zaha Hadid. There's a market. There is a different tolerance to styles today than I believe there ever has been. And that goes back to just the structure of society, probably. I mean, what's interesting about art is art has always been this open forum, right? Like it didn't matter. Like look at Lucian Freud. He was essentially, he was painting figure and portraits, and wow, some of the most amazing work. But there's a kind of classic order to that, right? Even though he might be using modern techniques and have his own sort of perspective and gaze, of course, that are quite unusual. But in the end, it's still okay to figure. It's still okay to look at the human form and depict it. In architecture, it's like that's not allowed. And that's the equivalent of classicism, right? Architecture, there's this absolute allergic reaction in the academy, which is modern and postmodern and neo-postmodern and post-neo-modern and deconstructivist, whatever you want to call it, to the classical practice of architecture. And I find that fascinating.
Well, I think that is interesting. I also think, there were a lot of different ideas that you were bringing out there. And I find it interesting as you talk about like the modernists, and the international style being a kind of simultaneously revolutionary and gatekeepy, like they had a very rigid formulation. Like I'm thinking, the Bauhaus instruction, they were teaching it should be in a certain way. And they had this manifesto of their ideas. And I feel like that's kind of true in every movement. To some extent, like there's always been some amount of like, these are the insiders and the leaders of this group. And, if you're not conforming to our way of thinking and creating, they're not as supportive of that.
The equivalent of that today is the assumption that if you're going to be practicing architecture, you should sort of focus on a project and an aesthetic and not stray and not be inconsistent. This idea of the exploring, wandering architect, there's a sort of derision to this, yet there's many examples of extraordinary architecture firms that experiment in different styles and aesthetic and kind of avoid a signature repetitive style. Now, you asked about Frank Gehry and Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Gehry, you could argue he repeated his style over and over again, and he even talked about this in certain circumstances. But the freedoms have changed, the ideologies have changed, the technology is also changing. So it's just so fundamentally different today than it's ever been, and that's going to lead to extraordinary forms and ways of of building architecture, but also architecture functions to sort of resolve human behavior in the physical world, right? And maybe that's what Richard Serra was saying. It's functional and it's compromised by all these things, these messy things, politics, materiality, technology, money, budgets. Whereas art is brought into the world without necessarily needing a function on the artist's ability to will it into being on its own, right? And I think that, like when you think about the possibilities for architecture today, there's in a way, I'd say it's more akin to an open framework than it is ideological anymore.
Well, and if I could, then I want to shift topics. So after a short break, I want to get into architecture today and more specifically your process and how you approach creating your work at Partisan Studio. Welcome back. My guest today is Alex Josephson, the co-founder of Partisans Studio, an architecture and design firm based out of Toronto. And, you're doing some really interesting work. The buildings I've seen, you work on a massive scale, but you do smaller pieces as well. Like I'm looking at your website, and that glitch tower is just amazing to me. But I'm curious if you could just walk us through on any project that you find particularly interesting, that you're passionate about, that it kind of exemplifies your ideas of design. Could you just walk us through like your process? How does it all begin for you, and how does it evolve in response to both ideas and materials limitations and what your goals are for the piece?
First of all, flattery gets you everywhere. We love being on Who Arted. So you've got a lot of questions in there.
Yeah, you can pick whichever ones you want to address and ignore the others.
But I think coming from someone did you grow up in Chicago?
Yeah, I've spent my whole life pretty much in and around the Chicago area, despite the fact that I call it Chicago and not Chicago, the way that,
is it
my
Chicago?
accent is. That's like, I've been told I don't have a Chicago accent, and I don't know where like my peculiar way of speaking came from, but maybe
you've been hanging around too many Canadians.
I don't know what it is, but
we're rubbing off on you.
Yeah, I don't know. I've spent pretty much like my whole life outside of like the odd month here and there, in Chicago.
But that means you're surrounded by some of the greatest pieces of architecture ever devised.
Oh, amazing pieces. Yes.
You've got the Carson Peary Scott building.
My dorm room was across the street from it,
Okay. So let's like, anyway, you asked about my architecture, but we were talking about modernism, and you asked me who my favorite architect is, and it's so hard. But you have an advantage being from Chicago, which is that your city has taken the Athenian oath that it somehow is going to leave the next generation better than the one before, and at least from a design perspective. That's always been the case with Chicago. Let's leave out the social part, because we all know there's all sorts of other issues going on there. But you guys have these just extraordinary pieces of architecture that kind of personify the apotheosis of each era, right? Like you have the most important architecture firms working there. You have it's so rich. And to hear you speak about artwork and be interested, I think it's a huge compliment. So let's talk about the glitch tower for a second, because you gravitated to that on our website. It's funny because not a lot of people necessarily gravitate to that. There's all sorts of other things. And you asked about process. What is the process? So you have to be, at least for Partisans, We don't have a preconceived idea of how something should look or perform. What we want to do is challenge ourselves. It's almost like being blindfolded in a dark room, searching for the exit. And we really want to challenge ourselves to discover many solutions, but discover the solution that we think is just the most fantastic for each circumstance and project. And it's a huge burden because you're staring into the abyss on every project with this perspective. And also, when it comes to process, it's like, well, how do you get your clients and how do you get your opportunities? Well, part of it is making our own opportunities, and I'll talk about that. And the other is sometimes clients come to you, but it's really about extraction. But we called ourselves partisans because we believe that you have to fight for a cause, and the cause is the design. And the cause is also the relevance of the project you're working on, and searching out relevance and helping people and groups of people to realize extraordinary outcomes when everybody said it was improbable or impossible, willing it into being. And so I didn't call our studio PB&J because at the time my partners and my initials would have spelled peanut butter and jam. We were very interested in what happened in the late 60s and the break from modernism to more expressive architectures, but also how that coincided with social activism and political activism, and how also architecture necessarily requires a group of people who believe in that cause. To make anything exceptional or interesting, as an architect, this idea that you're this lone soldier and you're going to get it done on your own, it's total BS. You need 100 Kyle Woods. You really do.
I think you need better stuff than this, but
you need people who care. And so that like before you even designed anything, you have to design the way to get the work.
So can I ask you, because I'm just picturing, I'm trying to imagine what the conversation is like, because you talk about your vision and you have a strong idea of what you want and what your priorities are, but you have to balance that with what the client's goals are. And so what's the initial conversation like? To take this specific example, the Glitch Tower.
There's no client for that. That's the best part. It's a provocation.
Explain that.
Yeah. So the Glitch Tower, at a certain point in time learned that basically, like, yes, you have to balance your client's budget, their programmatic requirements of what happens in this building, and your interest as an architect. There's so many things that go into architecture. And the Glitch Tower is really a representation of something we discovered in Canada, which is in Canada, you can basically build an extruded box and 50-story office building. And it essentially has to be completely repetitive in nature for it to make sense financially. Completely repetitive. And so the question is, what percentage of that form could be different and still make sense financially? And every market is different. And so, for example, we saw this building in Chicago, sorry, not Chicago, but Calgary. And it's this office tower, and its corners taper to the top, a bit thinner at the top. It's a box, but its corners are rounded and it tapers to the top. So every single corner piece, it technically is unique. But the building is just a simple glass, very, very minimal building. Well, just that element represents the entire, to do that stresses the Canadian market to the point where it's almost unaffordable. And that represented roughly 4.6% of the facade of the building. So 4.6% of the facade of the building could be interesting. And that was Canada. Okay. And we said, well, okay, let's explore this. What about New York? What percentage of facade in New York could be interesting? And these extrusions, we were talking about modernism earlier. Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and there's Gordon Bunshaft. There's a whole group of people that defined the tower, the modern tower, right? And it is defined as this rigid extrusion, hyper repetitive, elegant in its proportions, hopefully, but extraordinarily repetitive, and a result of the technologies and techniques of producing those elements that go into that building, right? And so he said, well, what does the glitch in this system look like? If we just can do a glass facade, what is it? What is the maximum disruption to that extrusion we can create and still make sense financially? And so the glitch tower was this attempt to say, well, in New York, we can build a radical extrusion as long as you let us do this here and there. And it's at once a kind of critique of the state of where we're at culturally, where the building has to perform financially, and they don't, and supposedly the clients don't care aesthetically, whereas the architects care about the aesthetics and what's left behind. Some clients do, most don't.
So in your experience, most clients, their primary focus is on, the cost per square foot and everything like that to make sure it makes sense financially. And as long as you can stay within budget and get them the space that they need to be functional, the architect has room to
yes. And therein lies the provocation. So as long as I can stay within your pro forma and the rest of the building looks dauntingly familiar, then I should be allowed to do this. And that is the glitch, which is a radical disruption of the classical glass box.
With your stance on architecture being, more provocative, more thoughtful, more creative, do you find that you're getting more clients who have more of a viewpoint artistically, and maybe they're, looking to find somebody who's bold enough to create that? Or are you finding more you have clients who are like, look, I don't have the artistic ideas, but clearly you do?
Yeah. There's a funny sign that someone, it's a meme that goes around the architectural world where it's like, architecture fees. I design it, you watch.
Yeah.
Like, and the most expensive one is you design it, I watch.
Yeah.
And obviously a studio like ours will self-select, right? Like, our mission is, our cause is clear. Our name means that we're probably not pushovers. We have a position, and it probably self-selects. And most people who want to do the designing, if they're a client, they won't come to us. But I think that on the other hand, it attracts people who are curious, people who are searching, clients who are trying to differentiate themselves and really be outstanding in whatever they do, whether it's a commercial client or an institution. We're designing a large amphitheater project right now with Gensler for Live Nation, and they didn't have to come to us. They could have, they made a choice that they wanted to do something special. And maybe we're lucky in so much, 12 years later after starting, that some people are starting to say, oh, we should contact or you should contact these guys, you should contact Partisans. And that's a lovely thing. But I would say that the road to getting the work is certainly more difficult when you take a position.
Can I ask you a little bit about that? Like an amphitheater project, they're coming to you. You say the clients come to you because they appreciate your work and everything like that. I'm curious, what's the conversation like? What are they bringing to you? Are they saying, I saw this piece that you designed and I want something that looks like that or has these qualities? Or are they saying, I know your stuff has this kind of a vibe. I want this kind of a feel to it. I want these, like, you see what I'm saying? Like, what priorities do they bring?
They said they wanted next generation talent from the city.
Okay.
So we checked that box. They wanted something interesting. They wanted a team that could really think about delivering an architecture that could be in conversation in a dignified way with some very, very important modernist structures around there. You have some of the most important metabolist buildings by Ebb Zeidler. Metabolism is an offshoot of strict modernism, and the idea was that you could componentize programs, and the outcome of aggregation or the stacking of these volumes created something that could be more than just a box. And you got these organic accumulations. They call it metabolist, i.e. they grow. And so you had this whole era of architecture that was quite extraordinary. And you could argue still influences a lot of what happens today, because this idea of aggregation, stacking, but offsetting to create a larger whole, kind of like how a cloud develops from vapors. This is kind of like, there's many ways of describing metabolism, but the client was very conscious of what was next door. And you had a Buckminster Fuller Dome, you had the Metabolist building, and the amphitheater had to be in conversation with that, and it needed to be decidedly of the day and the future, but in conversation with those other architectures. And they also wanted someone who was a team player, sometimes hiring a starchitect or someone who's got a gigantic ego and isn't willing to collaborate isn't necessarily going to get you the most ambitious architecture. And so I think they wanted a series of different things. And I also wanted to collaborate with a known quantity to them as a large company where they could feel comfortable that what was going to be delivered would be amazing and well built, and not just imagined by this group of ambitious young architects, which we are, right? It's a young office. And so I think it's a lot of things they were looking for. And we were very lucky, very, very lucky. And I think that, obviously some people think you make your own luck. I have been extraordinarily fortunate, and I think that I'm blessed to have that project. But we have others. We're working on the Hearn, which is the largest decommissioned power plant in North America, if not the world. It's, we're working on a music center in Puerto Rico, as I mentioned. We're working on projects for Air Canada around the world. We're trying to reinvent how that brand and the Canadian brand of a country are seen. And I think Canada right now has a moment, right? I think Canada is being looked at right now in a new light. And we want to be part of that. The Canadians have something to say to the world from a design perspective and a political perspective. And there's a window of opportunity right now. And one of the reasons I wanted to even do podcast interviews like this with people, generous and wonderful, curious people like you, Kyle, is it's very isolating being in Canada. We're just north of the most powerful nation in the world. You guys suck up a lot of oxygen. And so, like, part of the reason I want to have these conversations, which are so fascinating, is just to meet and hear and be part of a global dialogue. Because being in Canada, as fortunate as I am to have the work I have in Canada, I think it's important to potentially talk to people elsewhere and clients elsewhere and see if they're interested in our perspectives and our cultures of architecture and how we build and design. So that, I think, is another thing. It's an international company, Live Nation. I think they wanted a Canadian perspective.
And so now if I could ask you about the next step. So, you've got this big client, you've got this big project. You've already alluded to the fact that they were very conscious of what's around the building and that it needs to in some ways connect to play off of the surroundings and the history of the area where it's going into. Can you just help me understand how you and your team approach creating the design? What's the ideation look like? Are you sitting there making thumbnail sketches and then going to a CAD?
You've created a studio, you've created an ethos, you've leveraged every dollar of your scholarship to build something that you can bring into the world and show. All that's the table's set, right? Yeah. You have a room, you have people, you have collaborators, and you have a project. What is the project? Just like you said, what does the client come to you with? All of these things, the place, the context, the site, very important. Where is this going to be? The first thing is, it's almost like cooking. To cook a great meal, you do these great restaurants, the mise en place, the sauces, everything that happens in preparation before the dish is made is critical. And so there's this extraordinary operation of discovery and due diligence and fact finding and also questioning the client, like, why are you doing this? Not, yes, I'll do this for you, but why? Why are you doing it this way? What? And you made an assumption here. Did you know you made that assumption? And kind of extracting everything and putting it up on the wall. And the way we work is we sort of build this callus. It's kind of maybe it's our thing. It's like a three-dimensional equivalent on paper of what happens in Miro. Have you ever used Miro online where you just throw images onto it's like a digital whiteboard?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, so it's like Figma or Miro, but imagine a 8-foot tall by 10-foot wide crepe paper roll, which I have in the studio on a wall. And we start collaging everything from the site plan, the program, the data, the budget, the client, who's the client, what's the ambition, words, sketches, site plans, surveys, digital surveys, drone surveys. Everything is just it becomes this kind of callus.
So it's like a physical brainstorm.
Yeah, it's very physical. For me, it's very physical in the beginning. And then you're like, what the hell do we do here? Because again, we're not bringing this preconceived notion to each project. There's certain things we're interested in, of course, but the question is, can those interests fit? And if they don't, then they have to be thrown out. This idea that a preconceived aesthetic or way of building architecture is appropriate for every project is problematic for me. It means there's a disconnect between what's trying to be done and the interests of the architect to just submit their way of doing it with no mediation whatsoever. And I have a problem with that. So if something that we're interested in aesthetically doesn't work, but we really want to do it, we'll try it and test it and prod it. We'll draw it. We'll sculpt it. We'll print it in 3D and 2D. It's like Muhammad Ali, fly like a butterfly, design like a bee. You have to be able to zoom in and out at various scales, draw with a pen, input it in a computer, design and sculpt in a computer if necessary, depending on the project. And you have to be able to write. You have to be able to explain what you want to do. It's really almost it's chaos calm.
So then as you go through this process and you generate your ideas and you start to zero in on what you want it to look like, you said you draw it, then you draw it in the computer and sculpt in the computer and everything like that. How does the melding of the design aesthetic consideration come with the practical realities of engineering and material science here? Like, are you
Yes.
starting off with like, okay, I want it to look like this, and then figure out how to make that function with the materials at hand? Or do you know, like, okay, I can build this shell, and then what can I put around it? You see what I'm saying there?
Yeah, I totally understand. So it's project to project, but you have to integrate structural ideas and what you call mechanical or systems design from the get-go. If you're designing something and then and figuring out the structure and the systems later, it's a very painful process. So collaborating and being willing to collaborate and finding the best engineers in the world, I'm so excited. Our smallest project right now, I think, is our most important. We're working on a memorial with AKT engineers out of London here in Toronto. I can't say what it is because it's not public yet, but it's a memorial. And AKT is just such an incredibly important engineering firm in the world. And Eduardo Tibuzzi, who's a friend of mine there, we're collaborating with him. And it's like we're in the trench together.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not a post-rationalized approach to structure. It's how can we innovate with structure to convey a solemn idea and to create an impactful experience for those who visit this memorial. And so it starts with an exhaustive depiction of the site in 2D and 3D, analyzing the site from all sorts of different parameters, physically, but also acoustically, a lighting perspective, natural lighting, shadows, analyzing the zoning and legal realities of a site. Just getting everything organized before you start designing anything is very important because it should influence the design and it can make it better, even if you have very predisposed ideas, if you're very rigid that way. And we like the idea that there is a discovery that occurs or a series of discoveries that occur on a project that are really uncomfortable. And if we're feeling really uncomfortable, we're probably in a good place because it's going to be different. And then it's a question of controlling it so that whatever we're doing conceptually doesn't get awkward and doesn't get weird and feels like it's still uncomfortable, but wow, it's beautiful, right? And that privilege of being able to discover something on projects is really rare. And that's the kind of conditions that we thrive in, and we try to create for our clients, and that we advocate for our clients, because if they want to feel different, and if it's a commercial product, it needs to be different. They'll be able to argue that in the future, no one can compete against them.
Yeah. So you're basically talking to and working with the engineers from the beginning, starting off with just basically you do your homework first and understand the zoning regulations, the logistical concerns about everything related to that engineering. And that's a thought throughout the earliest stages and going on and revising from there. Which I guess, it makes perfect sense. It's the way you would ideally want to have something work from the start instead of trying to figure out how to make it work after the fact. But,
Yeah, I'll give you a small example. Like, a woman came to us 6 years ago to build her dream home. She'd made a lot of money, and she loved the bar we built, Bar Ravel, which is hewn in mahogany, and it's sort of the child of the grotto sauna, which was our first project. Our first real project was a sauna, and this sauna propelled our studio into a level at which we could get incredible work. And it was a small little building. It was 200 square feet. Maybe less, 150 square feet, that sauna. and she loved Baraval. And the sauna was this kind of grotto hewn in smooth cedar, like you're in a organic womb, shaped by the flows of heat, looking over the water. Then later, after that project kind of went viral, published all over the world, won awards everywhere. Small little thing, it's a sauna. We made it into something. Do you know what I mean, Kyle?
Yeah.
It didn't need to be unambitious just because it was a little sauna. You see?
Yeah.
And then the client for this house, I'll tell you about how it came to be. She went to Baraval, and Baraval, the client for that, was a tattooed, muscular set of guys. And so it was a response to their program, which was Art Nouveau, Barcelona, Prague, cafes and bars of Europe, the Art Nouveau period, and the incredible organic qualities of that. We reinterpreted that and we allowed we built the technology to actually carve that wood that way to make that project happen. And then so this new client, was so inspired by that, and she came to us with the program that for her dream house, and she had very particular ideas of how this thing should be. And that project now, which is it's going to be done this fall, is an extraordinary, I call it 3-form, because it's 3 forms interacting with each other in a kind of sinuous way, all clad in steel. And it's just, everybody comes to you with everybody comes to us with a different problem and a different dream. And we try to, the universe is expanding. We're rotating around the sun. We try to make every moment and everything we do while we're breathing worth it, And that's our mantra. The process is extraordinary. It's rigorous. It's not this messy, disorganized art studio. This is real information, real knowledge, real people, serious amounts of money. In some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions. And we take that responsibility with tremendous pride, and it's special. It's an incredible response. It's an incredible job, and I'm really happy I get to do it.
Now, I almost feel like that's a note to end on, but whenever I'm talking to a professional, working in the field, I always like to ask a little bit, some of my listeners are creatives themselves or aspiring creatives. And, so I'm going to ask you for 2 bits of advice for 2 different audiences. One would be for those who want to go into a design field and architecture, what advice would you give them? And for people who just want to see and appreciate good design, what are some of the hallmarks you notice that, people should be mindful of and appreciate about good design in your perspective?
Okay. I'll do the last one first. If something makes you uncomfortable, and at the same time you recognize the qualities of how it's been put together, give it a chance. Just because it's not familiar doesn't mean that it's not incredibly important for you to just savor that unfamiliarity, that anxiety. The world's so full of repetition and familiarity and risk-managed experiences. The next time you're in a place where you react and say, that's horrendous. Now, it might be because it truly is horrendous, but if it's just saying to you, oh, that's weird, or I don't appreciate that, I don't like it. Well, look a bit more carefully, because it's something's happening. It's an emotional response. And I go back to Richard Serra. If the architecture doesn't elicit an emotional response, it certainly isn't very successful. Now, obviously, mediocre architecture can elicit a very negative emotional response in people who demand more of the world. But if you're in a place and it makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable, but I don't mean uncomfortable in a kind of physical way. I mean aesthetically uncomfortable. That's interesting. Take another look at it. Enjoy that moment, and then look at the details of the materials and think about a person had to come up with this idea. They had to draw it. A group of people had to draw it. They had to convince someone to build or invest in it, and then they had to translate all that and convince a builder and their employees to put it all together. And then it came into the world, and you're there, and you're reacting to it. So I think just savor in that moment.
Yeah, I've always said like the surest sign that I'm going to be obsessed with something a year from now is when I absolutely hate it and the first like look at it, you know.
Yeah, like and the world is an interesting place. I mean, we all want to go to interesting places and different places. So think about that. We all want to be tourists. Yeah. Architecture can transport you. It can really be a metaphysical experience, a spiritual experience, and obviously the most lovely spiritual experiences are sometimes in lovely buildings, but they're also in landscapes, and sometimes architectures are landscapes as well. But I think that your other question about what advice I would give is like, I don't feel like I'm old enough to give advice. I guess my advice to anyone is, there's different temperaments, right? Like I always wanted to work for myself. Some people really want to be part of a team that does extraordinary things. Some people don't want to do that. And then some people want to build a team and build an idea. So I always wanted to build my own business, and everybody's different. I don't think that everybody has to be the same, and they don't have to have the same desires. But regardless of whether you want to, whatever pathway you take the risk. Take the risk.
Yeah, have the courage to dive in and do.
I had the courage during the pandemic to start a new business. Actually, I 8 years after starting an architecture firm, my father asked me to design his memorial, his monument, because he was on chemo. And he was still working, and he said, I'm probably not going to make it through this, because he got COVID and while he was on chemo. And he asked me to design his monument. And that process of potentially grieving him during the pandemic and being asked to design this grave and realizing that a physical grave couldn't describe my father's achievements in life, because he has so many, he's a really fascinating guy, got me designing this memorial. And it was all about memories and using my architectural background to take all that digital stuff, photos, writing, video, websites, achievements, notes, and putting that into a kind of experiential cloud and immersive architecture. And then my wife saying, hey, like, couldn't everybody like a digital memorial like this, where you can all come together and experience immersive memories like this for a family or a couple or a person? And I said, yeah, sure. And she said, you should write a deck and raise some money and build a tech company. And I did that. And it just because I have an architecture firm and I'm supposed to behave a certain way doesn't mean that at the age of 40 that I'm not allowed to start a new business, have it be influenced by my learnings in architecture, and do a good job in both. And so I raised enough money to start I raised money from American investors and started Cumulus. And it's it's a next generation digital memorialization platform. It's a digital cemetery, and it's 3D and immersive. And we're launching across 200 cemeteries in the United States right now, and funeral homes. So it's like, and it's all about leveraging architecture and design for the experience of something so primal, right? And it helped me grieve, but my dad survived. So in a way, it's beautiful. But you asked me the advice to give someone, and it's just like, I don't know. I just think that you have to take risks in life.
I think, there's something nice about somebody admitting that they don't know everything, and to be comfortable in the not knowing and still have the courage to explore is a beautiful thought and a wonderful thing to end on. And I'm also very happy that, your dad came out okay in the end, and it, seems to be an amazing positive. I mean, it's probably a wonderful and beautiful gift for him and for you that you were able to think through your feelings for him, and everybody's able to do that and still come out okay in the end.
So in the end, the lesson from we arted today was Frank Gehry and take risks.
I'll take it. And also a big thank you very much, Alex Josephson of Partisan Studio. I really appreciate your insights into architecture, design, and just all things associated with it. Thank you for taking the time.
Kyle, you're amazing. I had such a good conversation. Let's do it again soon.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.